Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Grand Rounds. My name is Dr. Rebecca Muley, and I'm one of the Grand Rounds co-directors, along with Dr. Adi Talati, who will be manning our Zoom, and Dr. Alexander Harris. Next week's Grand Rounds will be presented in person by Dr. Justin Richardson as part of the Dr. Ervil and Helen McKinnon Grand Rounds series. The title of his talk will be New Directions in Psychoanalysis, Emerging Insights from the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research. We do hope that you will join us in person. We have a lovely auditorium down here, and so if you're on site, please do join us down here. For more information on our future scheduled Grand Rounds, please visit our Grand Rounds calendar online. And if you would like to meet with an upcoming speaker, please email the Grand Rounds co-directors at grandrounds@nisbe.columbia.edu, and we'll connect you with their host or directly with the speakers. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that the next virtual town hall meeting for principal investigators is on Tuesday, May 28th at 10 a.m. To view the schedule for the upcoming town halls and roundtables, please visit the Safety Review tab of the HRPP section on Insight. Before we introduce today's speaker, I'd like to encourage everybody joining us to think of your questions if you're in the auditorium. We especially love to hear from trainees. And then if you're on the Zoom, please do post your question in the Q&A section of the chat. We can also promote you when you're on Zoom so that you can ask your question on the screen. And we can also ask that question for you as well. Please note if you're a trainee, and we'll also give special precedence to your questions. So today, it is our great fortune to welcome family physician and policy expert Dr. Kimberly Chang as our speaker in honor of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, as well as the National Mental Health Month. Before I do that, I'd like to welcome up Dr. Jacques Ambrose, the Chief Clinical Integration Officer and Senior Medical Director of our Psychiatry Faculty Practice Organization, a child psychiatrist and a fellow in the same program that Dr. Chang attended in the Minority Health Policy at Harvard, up to the stage to formally welcome her. So thank you, Dr. Ambrose.
Aloha, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, aloha kaku. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce and welcome a very dear colleague as well as a personal friend, Dr. Kimberly Chang, to give Grand Rounds today in honor of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So Dr. Chang is a family physician and director of the Human Trafficking and Healthcare Policy at the Asian Health Services in Oakland, California, and the Speaker of the House for the National Association of Community Health Centers. As a fellow in Minority Health Policy at HMS, she completed a policy practicum addressing the role of health centers in caring for victims of human trafficking. Dr. Chang has provided care for many commercially sexually exploited children, has trained thousands of US and international frontline multidisciplinary professionals on the healthcare intersect with human trafficking. She has also provided expert testimony to Congress on best practices in rescuing trafficking victims. In 2021, she was appointed by President Biden on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders through the White House initiative within the US Department of Health and Human Services. So without further ado, please join me in giving Dr. Chang a round of applause.
Okay, can you all hear me? All right. Simon, are you going to pull up the slides here? All right. So first thing, good morning. Good morning. You can do better than that. Good morning. Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Muley and Dr. Ambrose, for welcoming me here today for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, as well as National Mental Health Month. I'm going to talk about the histories and legacies of Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander racial exclusion in the United States, talking about immigration, the causes of precarity, the relations to human trafficking, and the healthcare intersection. It's a little bit different. I was talking with Dr. Muley about this. It's a little bit different than your traditional psychiatry gone round. So I hope that you will stay with me and engage in some of this journey with me today. I have no financial disclosures, and here are the learning objectives to talk about the differences between labor trafficking, sex trafficking, labor exploitation, sex exploitation, identify 3 harms of human trafficking and exploitation, as well as identify, and this is probably for me the most important thing, at least 2 historical federal legislative acts leading to the exclusion of Asians, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in the United States. This is important as we talk about the causes and conditions for vulnerability and precarity leading to people being exploited and trafficked. So first off, I want to start by introducing my family, and I call this my family's living memory because this is my mother, and this is her great-grandmother, right? Her great-grandmother here. This is when her great-grandmother got married in 1898. So my mom remembers her great-grandmother. This is my great-grandfather, her grandfather, and I remember him. He was born in 1900, and he died in 1997, my second year of medical school. This is my grandmother. She just died 2 years ago at the age of 98, and she was born in 1923. I talk about the living memory because when I talk about the history of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in the United States, it's not so far removed from many of you in this audience. It's not so far removed from your ancestors, from the living memory of your family, and how those policies and legislative policies of the United States may have created different conditions and circumstances that have changed or guided the trajectories of your lives or the lives of your patients and community. My great-grandfather was born in 1900, and that's just a mere 18 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So I would this is the sort of the roadmap for the talk. I'm going to talk about how I came into this work. First, by awareness and listening. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the history of place, the place of where I work now. It's called Asian Health Services, a community health center in Oakland, California. Talk a little bit about the history of that place. I'm going to talk about the history and time. This is where the history of the Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in the United States comes into play. And then I'm going to talk about possibilities for the future, how we can intervene and create policies that increase access to systems of care and protection to decrease vulnerabilities for exploitation and human trafficking. Does that make sense? Is this better? This better? Okay, thanks. I'm the guinea mice. This is the first time we're using this equipment. It's brand new for the department, so thank you for experimenting on me. Awareness, listening to people and patients. So how many of you know what this character is? There's some folks in here who may speak Chinese, read Chinese. This is the character for Ting, for listening. If you can see in Chinese, the pictograph character includes the ear, Ting, maximum, focus, or eye, single, and heart, a composite of all of these different characters. Why? Because when you listen to someone, you want to give them the respect and attention as if you would a king. You listen with your ear, your mind, your focus, and your heart. So I bring that up because many of you are clinicians, many of you take care of patients, and this is what we're trained to do, to give our respect and our ability to listen with focus and heart and mind to our patients. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the patients that I saw. So all of what I do has originated from being a family practice physician at a community health center and just seeing patients in the clinic. So I'm going to tell you some stories. I've been raped 2 times. Then I've been tortured by 2 guys in 2 days. These are the words of a patient of mine who understood her role and her place in this world. So I'm tired, girls dying, people catching AIDS. So I don't want to be doing it because that can be me. These are the words of a patient of mine who understood what her future holds. It's like if you die, get murdered or something, all it is they have another girl taking their place. That's all it is. These are the words of a patient of mine who understood how much her life mattered. So I listened. I listened to what my patients were telling me as I was treating them in the teen clinic for reproductive health issues, for violence, abuse, and trauma, for contraceptive pregnancy issues. So what is human trafficking? So those young women, those girls were being trafficked, sexually trafficked. So what is human trafficking? How many of you know what human trafficking is? Right, so it's a crime, right? It's federally defined as a crime. It's in the criminal justice system. And it was first defined legislatively as a crime under the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000. Human trafficking is defined as severe forms of sex trafficking, a commercial sex act with force, fraud, or coercion, or a commercial sex act in which someone has not yet turned 18 years old. It's also defined as labor trafficking, which is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So this is important, but you know, what does that have to do with us? We're healthcare professionals. We're not criminal justice investigators. We're not in the law enforcement system. And so when I was seeing patients, I thought, well, I don't know if my patients are gonna be qualified for these definitions of criminal justice, human trafficking. So we actually now in healthcare expand the definition for what we're talking about. We're talking about in healthcare exploitation. And if you can see here, labor trafficking is the smallest, most well-defined specific form of labor exploitation, where labor exploitation is in it, where an employer unfairly benefits from an employee's work. It's not a legal term. In fact, not all forms of labor exploitation are illegal. And then labor violations, which is a legal term, used when employers violate federal, state, or municipal laws related to worker treatment, workplace safety, or record-keeping requirements. And then finally, labor trafficking. Now, this is important because when we see patients in the healthcare setting, we're not making the determination of whether they've been trafficked or not. We're looking at the harms that they're experiencing, the harms and symptoms that they're presenting with, and then making the determination, well, are they being exploited? And then interfacing with criminal justice if we need to. Same thing for sex trafficking. Sex trafficking at the center, most specific criminal justice definitions, sexual exploitation, and then sexual violence, which is much more broad. So that's what I care about. I care about the experiences of our patients, how they present with their harms and the symptoms that they are experiencing. So I'm going to talk a little bit. We have an intimate partner violence expert in the audience. I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection between intimate partner violence and human trafficking. The dynamics are very similar. It's an interplay between power and control. And you can see here a study, a very small study in New York City, where they looked at commercially sexually exploited trafficked victims. And most of them were people that they knew, an interplay with intimate partner violence, domestic violence, the similar dynamics with physical and sexual violence, restrictions on freedom and movement and control, isolation, financial control, fear and intimidation, fostering of drug and alcohol dependencies to their situations. The harms are very similar with violence. They're interrelated with violence, abuse, and trauma. I'm not going to belabor the issue. Patients can present with exacerbations of chronic disease, mental health conditions, behavioral health conditions, pretty much anything, because they're humans, and the causes of stress and the causes of violence, abuse, and trauma can manifest in many different ways. Other health impacts. For intimate partner violence, this is very well known that strangulation and traumatic brain injury is very common in intimate partner violence. It's no different for human trafficking and exploitation. And you folks are probably looking at this image and thinking, that's not a correct psychiatric image, but you know, it's just a representation. So traumatic brain injury and strangulation, very important to consider when you're taking care of patients who have experienced exploitation or human trafficking. A lot of behavioral health issues. When we talk about substance use and dependencies, we also think about the fact that when people are being controlled, sometimes the traffickers use substances to buy their victims with so that they can work more, so that they can be numbed and continue to be exploited and harmed. We also talk about how substances and dependencies are used to control the victims in the sense that they're being used to threaten their victims or their patient, the patients with law enforcement or interventions from criminal justice. Women may also be more likely than men to use prescription opioids to self-medicate for other problems, including anxiety or stress. So when you are seeing patients in your psychiatry clinics or psychology clinics, make sure that you think about exploitation and other kinds of harms that your patients may have experienced. Reproductive coercion is another one where it is used as a way to maintain power and control in a relationship, particularly for intimate partner violence and human trafficking. I'm not going to belabor this issue, but that's something you should think about. All right, one more patient. I'm going to intersperse this talk with stories of my patients. So BK was a 14, 15-year-old Cambodian American teen who came into my teen clinic one night. She was very sick. She had a fast heartbeat. She had a high fever. She had lost 30 pounds over the past 3 months. Sometimes she missed her appointments with me. She had swollen joints, rashes all over her body, and she could barely walk. I told her she needed to go to the hospital because we couldn't take care of her or diagnose her in the outpatient setting. And she absolutely refused. She told me I'd rather die than go back to jail. On a previous hospitalization for a miscarriage, she was discharged to the county jail because there was a bench warrant for her arrest for failing to show up to court on charges of solicitation, prostitution. That night, she didn't go to the ER, and I thought she was going to die. You want to know what happened to her? Okay, so you have to keep listening because I'm going to tell you at the end. Okay, history of place. This is where part 2. I want to talk to you. Sorry, I don't see the time on here, and I'm not sure what time I'm at. 11:20. Okay, perfect. Going a little bit faster. Okay, so the history of place where I work. I work at a community health center. How many of you are familiar with community health centers? Okay, so wow, you're all familiar with community health centers. One of the best things about them is that they exist in every single state, territory, and District of Columbia. There's about 1,400 community health center corporations across the United States and in DC and the territories, serving 31.5 million patients, underserved patients across the United States, mostly medically underserved populations in medically underserved areas. 25% are limited English proficient. 4 great things about community health centers are that they have to provide comprehensive primary care to patients. They have to provide an affordable sliding scale, so we are required to see anybody regardless of insurance status. Again, medically underserved areas or medically underserved populations. And the best thing that I think about community health centers is that our board of directors, the people who have the power to hire and fire the chief executive, the boss, 51% of the board of directors have to be patients of the system. That means we're absolutely accountable to our communities and the problems that we see. Community health centers started out of the civil rights movement in the late 50s and 60s when people were agitating for their civil rights. Healthcare became one of them. And if you can recall, Malcolm X called for nonviolence. and in a 10-plank plan. One of them was healthcare. And Martin Luther King Jr., in his speech in 1963, said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and most inhuman because it often results in physical death. He also said, we are concerned about the constant use of federal funds to support this most notorious expression of segregation. And I see no alternative to direct action and creative nonviolence to raise the conscience of the nation. So very explicitly connecting injustice in health with federal funds and federal policy. In 1964, President Johnson, through all of that community organizing and advocacy and agitating for healthcare for underserved communities, initiated the first war on poverty, in which the first demonstration grants for community health centers funding was provided. Asian Health Services, where I work, is no different. We have a dual mission to serve and advocate for the medically underserved, including the immigrant and refugee Asian community. And so we have a lot of early wins at Asian Health Services at my community health center. I'm just going to give a couple of them. In 1978, the county was going to cut all of our funding because there was a property tax reform. We organized, mobilized, closed all of the clinics together, showed up at the county hospital with all these monolingual, non-English speaking patients, demanding services and saying, are you going to be able to handle this load of patients if you shut down all the community health clinics? So Prop 13 passed, but our funding to the community health centers was maintained and intact. So that was an early win. 1982, my health center filed an administrative complaint with the Office for Civil Rights because the county hospital didn't have interpretation or language services for our patients. So our patients who didn't speak English were effectively shut out from receiving specialty care or hospital care. So we filed this Office of Civil Rights complaint, and that resulted in the first language interpretation unit in the United States for hospital settings. And then, how many of you are familiar with the Heckler Report, 1985? Dr. Ambrose is. Okay, so this Heckler Report, 1985, is the first time the federal government ever released a report on Black and minority health under the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Margaret Heckler. This was under President Ronald Reagan, actually. It was in 1985. Yeah, first time ever. And so if you think about it, all of our equity and health equity initiatives rest upon this seminal report. And in this report, it was mostly Black and Latino health. There was one small section on Asian and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander health. And in it, it talked about 4 different things. It presented a model minority for health outcomes. It talked about the language and culture importance. It talked about disease-specific disparities, and it talked about disaggregation of data. And that has become sort of the 4 pillars of what we advocate on for an Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander health care. And so what did it exactly say? Model minority myth. The Asian Pacific Island minority in aggregate is healthier than all racial ethnic groups in the United States, including whites. We weren't going to let this stand because we knew that our patients at Asian Health Services were not healthy. They were not well. They were very sick. They weren't getting access. So we weren't going to let a statement like this stand. Cultural differences and language difficulties are major barriers for immigrants and refugees, Asian American and Pacific Islander immigrants and refugees. Asian Pacific Islanders have higher rates for TB, hepatitis, anemia, and hypertension, some disease-specific disparities. And there's also significant subgroups in this population. For example, Southeast Asians, other recent immigrants and refugees, and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders who have specific health problems not reflected in the national data, talking about data disaggregation. So we use this document to advocate. And there were no, at the time, federal or national organizations advocating on behalf of Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders. So what do? We started in 1986, the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum. 1987, grouped together community health centers that were serving a lot of AA and HPIs. We started APCHO. And then in 1999, our health center played a key role in executive order under President Clinton, 13125, which started the very first White House initiative on AAPIs, the very body upon which I sit now as a commissioner. So this is important. Policy matters, organizing matters, advocacy matters. If you don't raise up these issues from the ground level up, you don't get heard, and your communities and your patients don't get resources. All right, so that's the history of place. Now, what I want to do is shift gears a little bit and talk about the history and time. You heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. I mentioned that earlier, where my great-grandfather was born a mere 18 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of exclusion of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in the United States, because that sort of sets the tone for why there were vulnerabilities for the patients that I was seeing in my clinic, the Cambodian American teens, the Chinese American teens who were being exploited and sex trafficked. So history and time. You don't know no history, no self. If you know history, you know yourself. That's on the t-shirt here. So let me ask you this. How are people made vulnerable to being exploited? How do we, as a body politic, create vulnerabilities for people to be exploited and trafficked? And what are the historical roots of human trafficking? What time is it? 11:30. Okay, good. So any ideas here? Structural inequities caused by, what causes those structural inequities? Anybody? Power differentials? Well, you can have power differentials, but how does it become systematized, right? And so when we think about that, we think about the policies that are made. Policies that are made create the categories of who's included for protection and who's excluded from access to systems of care and protection. So very important, I want you to think as you do your work in your daily lives, in your research, don't be agnostic in your research. Think about how is this gonna impact policy? Who's gonna be included? Who's gonna be excluded? How's it gonna affect people and communities and their lives and their health? That's how I think. That's what our Dr. Ambrose and my fellowship taught us. Policies, 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 policies. So what are the historical roots of human trafficking? So fortunately, there's a textbook. You can read it. I did a chapter in it on the immigration and xenophobia. But it's systematic structures. You talked about it already. Power differentials. Who has the power? Who makes the policies? Who's included? Who's excluded? And it's really isms and phobias, in a sense, create the conditions for vulnerability and precarity through policy and practice. So capitalism is not evil. It's a tool. It's a way of ordering our economics. But who's the winners and who is excluded from reaping the benefits of all that capital? Racism, who's included and excluded. I'm not going to belabor these two issues. I'm not going to really talk about that much. I do have a presentation that does incorporate that, but for the purposes of this one, I'm going to focus on xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment. And then sexism and homo or transphobia. There's others, but those are some of the big ones in this textbook, and talks about how it relates to creating the conditions for vulnerability for people to be exploited and trafficked. All right, so OT, another patient of mine. OT was a 24-year-old G1P0, so her first pregnancy. She never had a baby before. She was experiencing a lot of morning sickness, throwing up like constantly. She would come into the clinic needing IV fluids from us because she was so dehydrated from the morning sickness. And she couldn't work. She worked at a local restaurant. She couldn't work. So I, me being a primary care doc, I said, well, you can't work. Let me give you a note. I wrote a note, please excuse her from work. She can't work. She's throwing up all the time. She's sick. She comes back 2 days later, really upset. I cried. Oh, my boss is mad. He says, if I can't work, then I'm fired. I'm fired. I don't have a job, but I need the job. Can't work. This is terrible. Crying. And I said, wow, well, wait a second. Pregnancy is a protected illness. So you shouldn't be fired. Let me write another note. I wrote another note. This is not legal. This is wrong. You need to keep her job. And she's sick. Comes back. She takes it. And meanwhile, she doesn't really speak. She doesn't speak English. So she's bringing my note to the employer. She comes back a couple days later, even more distraught. Oh my gosh, the boss is really mad. Now he says he's going to fire me, my husband, my brother-in-law, and all the Chin employees at the restaurant. Chin is a refugee group from Burma. They all worked at this one particular restaurant. And, that was this trafficking? I don't know. Was it a vulnerability? Yes. Was it exploitation? For sure. Was it labor violations? Absolutely. Were there threats and coercion? And yes. So what we did was we connected her with our civil legal aid groups. And that was the end of it for me, my part. 5 years later, I come back from fellowship. In the newspaper, there's a big article about this restaurant and this restaurant group getting multi-million-dollar fines for labor violations, wage and labor violations. And so, right, so this is how exploitation shows up. One way exploitation showed up in my clinic. So let's talk about xenophobia and immigration. These are all the different kinds of labels over history that have been used for people who are coming into this country. All of these labels have different categories of who's included and what benefits and eligible for what protections and resources. All of these different labels just to include or exclude people in the United States from systems of care and protection. So let's do a little historical review. How many of you know, I talked about it, how many of you had heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882? Okay, so pretty much all of you, right? So in 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act, reactionary legislation because of labor, the labor movement in the United States at that time, all excluded from coming into the United States. Do you folks, let's see, was this the first time the United States limited people from coming into the United States? What do you think? No, so you say no. Do you know of what legislation there was before? That's okay, but you're right, it wasn't. The actual first legislation that closed the borders for the first time to the United States was in 1875, the Page Act. And it was explicitly excluding Oriental women, people who looked like me, from coming into the United States because they were presumed or identified as sex workers. Page Act, 1875, the first time. And in this legislation, correlated Oriental women with being sex workers and saying that they were a menace to public health. So correlating health issues and that kind of fear in the United States to justify exclusion. That was the first time the United States closed the border to anyone, Oriental women, explicitly connecting them with sex prostitution, basically. So that was the first time. In 1888 to 1892, during this time, The geopolitics was very fraught. It was the first time the US government mandated that Asian people or Chinese specifically had to carry photo identification. Or if they didn't have it and they were detained, they could be detained on the spot indefinitely and made to work in hard labor. So now think about the identification requirements now. So this is the first time those photo identification requirements were used. So restrictions when you're here in the United States. 1898, it was the illegal annexation of the Hawaiian kingdom under duress. Capitalist land barons and plantation owners in Hawaii held the Queen Liliuokalani, under guns, and refused to let her leave the palace, the Iolani Palace, until she signed away the Kingdom of Hawaii. So excluded. And to this day, there's still a movement to denounce the illegal annexation of the Kingdom of Hawaii. In 1907 to 1908, Japan was a rising imperial power. The United States did not want to risk war, even though they didn't want Japanese here either. But because of the risk of war with the rising imperial power, they sort of made a back-end gentleman's agreement that Japan would restrict emigration from their country to the United States on their end, and the United States didn't have to enact their own legislation restricting immigration from Japan. So they were sort of okay for now, as long as Japan did their part. In 1917, anybody knows what happened in 1917? This is big. 1917 Immigration Act. Okay, so in the 1917 immigration law, the legislation created an Asiatic barred zone. The barred zone was everything in this purple demarcated area. This hashtag Chinese Republic was already excluded, but anything in this purple area was excluded from coming into the United States. So what is that? It's like pretty much everything. Except here it's this yellow. What's here in the yellow? Does anybody know? What country is it? It's the Philippines. So why was the Philippines carved out? Yeah, it's a territory, right? It's a territory of the United States. Who said that? I don't know who said that. Yeah, it's part of the United States. So the people in the Philippines could pass into the United States. They were considered nationals, but they couldn't be citizens. They could just come in and out. Okay, so basically the Asiatic barred zone. So what we have then, basically everything was excluded, right? 1924, Japan wasn't doing a very good job of limiting their immigration of their citizens into the United States. And so the United States government got kind of irritated and they enacted another immigration act, the Johnson-Reed Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, and excluded Japanese and Koreans. And then what do we have here? 1933. What about the Filipinos? What happened in 1933 for the Filipinos? 1933 was Philippines' independence. And so they are no longer a part of the United States. They can no longer come in. So they are now excluded. So this is, and then what do we have? December 7th, 1941. Dr. Ambrose and I are both from Hawaii. What happened in December 7th, 1941? Pearl Harbor happened. In reaction to that, the Japanese internment camp happened. So now Japanese American citizens are now excluded. So when you think about this, in addition to other exclusions, regulatory exclusions in the United States, like redlining, like racial housing covenants, where I live right now in Oakland, the neighborhood I live in, still has some housing covenants that say that that Asians, Orientals couldn't buy property there. It's now illegal, you can't do that, but it still exists in some of these covenants. And then redlining affected Black folks as well as Asian folks, Oriental folks. And so, all of these exclusions create the vulnerabilities and the limitations from wealth generation and capital, right? We know that capital and wealth is protected in many cases from social vulnerabilities. And so these are some of the ways that xenophobia, anti-immigration creates vulnerabilities for folks to be exploited and trafficked. All right, so SC was a she was 40 something, early 40s, sex trafficked Chinese immigrant. She was sex trafficked in Santa Clara County, which is a county south of the county where I practice in California. And she had an open sex trafficking case. She was plugged into criminal justice. She was identified as a victim. They were moving forward with the prosecutions and the investigations. And I get a call from the case manager at the community health center in Santa Clara County. And she calls me and says, I have this patient. She is being sex trafficked, had been sex trafficked here, but she actually lives in Oakland. And because she lives in your county, her Medicaid or her Medi-Cal insurance dictates that she has to get her health care up in your county. So it's just a weird California, if you're on Medicaid, you get health care in the county that you live in. So she was sex trafficked down there, lived up where we are, so had to receive care. Case manager asked me, can you see her? Because it's too hard for me to come back and forth to bring her up to the clinic and drive her, the 2 hours each way. And I said, sure. Are there any needs that she has, any medical needs or any immediate needs? Like, because there's a little bit of a waiting list to get a new appointment. And the case manager says, well, no, I don't think so. She's pretty healthy, but I want to visit her at her house, at her apartment. And she might not have good nutrition because she's just eating all these boxes of ramen or these packages of ramen that are stacked up to the ceiling in her apartment. So her nutrition's probably not that good. I said, oh, really? Why is that? I mean, is it she doesn't have money or something, or does she need any, food stamps or other things like that? She says, no, she just told me that she thinks that she won't eat anything outside of the home that she prepares. She thinks that everyone's trying to poison her and that the trafficker's trying to poison her. And so they're all out there, all trying to poison me. So I said, I'm not sure. I'm not a psychiatrist. So I said, well, I'm not sure. So let's get her hooked into our specialty mental health division. We have a partnership with specialty mental health psychiatry. She also had some substance use issues, so it could have been that as well. And I said, it doesn't sound like there's any physical medical need, but she needs some sort of mental health, specialty mental health assessment. So we got her hooked in to our specialty mental health clinic. I don't know what happened to her, but I was happy that we had that partnership and that integration of medical and behavioral health and specialty mental health. So that's another patient. So sexism, I talk about this because I'm just going to bring this up because if you think about the shooting that happened in Georgia, do you folks remember that a couple years ago? The reporting on it was that these massage workers were being trafficked, or they were sex workers. They could have been exploited or trafficked. And just want to point out the fact that, this quote here, experts say following an antiquated playbook does little to protect women, often exploited by a billion-dollar industry propelled by a toxic mix of racism, misogyny, and fetishization. Arresting low-level female workers, they say, further stigmatizes a population at risk of violence and trafficking. You can see here, just in a lay article, the connection between the policies that protect and exclude, include for protection or exclude for protection. And then relating it back to the misconceptions and the biases and stereotypes, racial stereotypes, even going back to the Page Act in 1875, the suspect told law enforcement officials he had frequented 2 of the spas, describing them as temptations for his sex addiction that he needed to eliminate. So these kinds of biases and stereotypes and policies have long-term effects. And if we don't continue to recognize them and combat them, these kinds of harmful effects can continue. Sexism creates vulnerabilities for all genders. I don't have to belabor this issue, but I did want to point out that for men and boys, gender stereotypes and biases obscure and invisibilize male victims and survivors of sexual violence, exploitation, and human trafficking. Same thing for non-binary or trans folks. DH, another patient of mine, he was a transitional age male patient, half Vietnamese, half African American. He was a foster youth. Both of his parents had died, and he was now transitional age, and he was unsheltered. He was homeless. And when I was doing my history with him, I just asked him about exchanging sexual acts for anything of value, just getting to the exploitation or trafficking issue. And he basically said, yeah, I did it because she bought me some video games I wanted. An invisibilized, unrecognized victim who was trafficked, exploited when he was a youth in foster care. Nobody caught it. Why? Probably because of gender stereotypes. And he was homeless at the time. So anyway, I just bring that up just to, again, highlight that presentations of people who are trafficked can be in many ways. Homotransphobia, also excluding people. LGBTQ populations have high rates of being trafficked, sex trafficked, and exploited. And it was only in 1973 when the DSM removed homosexuality as a mental health disorder. The World Health Organization only removed this in 1992. This is within my lifetime. Homosexual acts criminalized in the United States until 2003. That's just 21 years ago, people. And there's continued exclusions of protections and access to systems of care and protection for these populations. Again, driving folks underground, making them more vulnerable to being exploited and trafficked and abused and harmed. All right, so possibilities for the future. Policy can be a weapon or a salve. We can use it, it's a tool. I hope that we all connect our work with ways that we can increase access to systems of care and protection. At Asian Health Services, you heard about our mission, a dual mission of service and advocacy. So we do our direct service. We have the integration of behavioral health. We know that there is the distinction between mind and body is arbitrary, that we need you folks in psychiatry, psychology to be with us, and we need to be with you, caring for our patients and our communities in a holistic way. So we've tried to do that. It's hard when the policies of funding separate us. We've tried to do some research, original research, not mice research, but other kinds of research. And to inform research, to give the context. Research can be data driven, but I heard from my colleagues a couple weeks ago at Harvard that research should often be data informed, and that the context of people in the communities that you serve should provide that context for the data to inform how it's applied. And then policy. This is what I love. This is what I think, how I can make a difference in protecting our patients and our communities. And these are some of the ways I think about it, getting involved in local policies, state policies, and national policies to make a difference. Advocacy is hugely important, and media advocacy is very, very important. This was the New York Times did a little feature on some of our work in, I think it was 2011. So, and that really helped raise the awareness of trafficking and exploitation and getting protections for our patients. So media advocacy, and in this day and age, all of you have access to media. and communications. You can do it on your own with social media, with LinkedIn, the internet. So really, if you care about the issue, you can use your voice to raise it and create change. This was the briefs that I did in my policy fellowship, the same one that Dr. Ambrose did. And we used it, and within 5 years, everything that we recommended in 2015 came to fruition by 2020. And so this is the kind of policy work that I do now. I work with Futures Without Violence, Health Partners on IPV and Exploitation, a national training and technical assistance partner for health centers on intimate partner violence and exploitation trafficking. I serve on the National Advisory Committee on the sex trafficking of children and youth in the United States, giving recommendations for states on best practices. That is going to be re-upped soon, shortly, to include child labor exploitation and trafficking. So that's going to be re-upped. I serve on the National Association of Community Health Centers. Again, you heard 31.5 million patients served by a community health center. That's a huge number of people that policy can impact if we can get the health centers on board with this kind of work. And then I serve on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, giving recommendations to the federal executive branch on ways to increase equity, justice, and opportunity for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Really important. So BK, you guys want to know what happened to her? Okay, so she didn't go to the hospital that night. I freaked out. I thought I had just sent her to die at home. And luckily at the health center, we have community health workers. We had a youth program. They knew everybody in the community. We violated all kinds of HIPAA to find her. We located her the next day. Our case manager, our commercially sexually exploited program director went to her, talked with her, drove her to the hospital. She got admitted for like 2 months, and she survived. She survived. So that was great. 2 months later, guess where she was discharged to? Yeah, she was discharged to the county jail. Again, bench warrant issues. The next day after discharge, the county jail, guess what happened? Bounced back to the hospital because they didn't give her meds. So I know, so, kind of a lot of policy issues there that need to be worked out. But she did survive. So that was, if we look at the endpoints and the end outcomes, I think that's the most important one. Okay, so some policy wins. For California, for child sex trafficking, youth could no longer be arrested or prosecuted for prostitution or solicitation. That was enacted in California legislature. It was a law change. This was also a law change, diversion to safe harbor programs if youth were arrested for other acts and they were found to be sexually exploited. Third, again, I think this was a regulatory change, that commercial sexual exploitation of a child became defined as child abuse. So the Child Welfare Department now had jurisdiction instead of criminal justice. And then the Child Welfare Department was required to develop policies, protocols, and procedures to care for commercially sexually exploited children. All wins after 2015. National wins in healthcare policy for human trafficking. It's increasingly recognized in the healthcare setting as something that we can recognize and intervene on. National associations, medical societies, medical education. There are ICD-10 codes, International Classification of Disease codes for exploitation. Those were released in 2020. If you know anything about ICD-10 codes, they actually have to be approved by Congress. So that's a kind of a huge thing that they were approved in bulk with the other ICD-10 codes. For us in federally qualified health centers, we are required to report a standard set of metrics to the federal government. It's called the Uniform Data System. And now there were new required reporting measures for exploitation and intimate partner violence. That started in 2020. And then the National Training and Technical Assistance Program for FQHCs, Health Partners on IPV and Exploitation, that started in 2020. That was another recommendation from my policy work. And then pilot demonstrations from the Administration for Children and Families on this topic. Funding, money to the community to do this work. Very important. Because commitment without cash is counterfeit. You can write that down. In May last year, we brought in the assistant secretary of the Administration for Children and Families and the associate secretary. He is now the acting assistant secretary, Jeff Field. We brought them into our community, to our community health center, and we had a roundtable, and we said, hey, these are the things that are going on. How are you going to fund it? How are you going to give us resources? How are you going to attend to the community? So really important, some of this policy advocacy work, direct policy advocacy to the administrators. Really important. Anyone can do this. You folks can do this. You can reach out. They're public officials. Reach out to them if you're working on something. And so my basic take-home point is that we must be advocates for policies that increase access to systems of care and protection. And there is power in organizing, in advocacy, and in policy. We can focus on exclusion and inequity and turn it into inclusion and equity. And I just like this picture. It's my mom and my grandma, and their shirt says unite. So that's it. That's all I got for you folks. Feel free